Hello everyone, I'm Jim Falk, the Interim Executive Director of CIR. I'm delighted to see so many faces, new faces, as well as friends that I met just a few weeks ago when we had our first in-person program with David Farstein. Let me just say what a privilege it is for me, and I'm not going to introduce her now, but in a few minutes, but to have our first, while I'm here, diplomatic visitor to be Rachel McCormick. I have had a long and very really treasured relationship with the Consulate of Canada for a number of years, even when I had a little bit of hair on my head. Just a wonderful consulate. The Consulate General in Dallas is the only Consulate General in the city. Every other office is a consul, and we're so glad to at least have one in Dallas that is not in Houston. Many of the consulates that are in Houston or in Dallas cover New Mexico. And one of our goals at CIR, is certainly one of my goals while I'm either executive director or involved with the board, is to have more diplomats that have jurisdiction for New Mexico, either in Los Angeles or Denver, or some of the honorary consuls, to encourage their ambassadors and ministers to come to Santa Fe. So I hope we can continue to see a large growth. So just because she's in Dallas, today she's in Santa Fe, and she will say, I'm the Consul General for Santa Fe, New Mexico, Arkansas, and she'll put Texas at the end of the list. Also want to be sure that I see Henry Wells, who's been with the consulate for not quite the 50 years of existence, but almost. Henry, stand up so we can recognize you. And a man who I've wanted to meet, but he was busy until last Tuesday. That's the mayor of our city. Alan Weber, would you please stand? Congratulations on your re-election. So I also said I had a special tie to Canada, and my wife Terrell is there. Terrell, Terrell, would you stand up so everybody can meet you, please? We have a son-in-law who is a professional hockey player in Canada. And so our daughter will soon be, we hope, a Canadian citizen, and certainly our grandchildren are. So that's another tie. Canada has always sent its best and brightest to this region. And while you're enjoying your lunch, I want you to think about something that I read about today. Rachel, you know George Friedman, and I've recommended that many of you read George Friedman, Geopolitical Futures. And this morning, just by happenstance, the title of his article was Canada, Mexico, and America's Reality. Rachel, have you read this yet? Aha. So, he says the United States lives in a fundamentally unique geopolitical reality. And he goes on and he says, therefore, in any discussion of American strategy and of its strategic priorities, the most important issue is not the South China Sea or even NATO, but the maintenance of relations with Canada and Mexico. It is true that at the moment each country has an overriding interest in maintaining their relationship for reasons ranging from trade to social links. It's also true that the United States could impose its will militarily on either country. However, waging war on neighbors is dangerous and exhausting. America is a global power pursuing global interest, and its domestic stability would be the first casualty of any assault against Canada or Mexico. He also goes on to say, there are forces driving the U.S. apart from Canada and Mexico. He mentions the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline, a project that was important to Canada. And it showed that we did this with little consultation, no offer of compensation, nor any attempt to create an alternative project. So as we enjoy our lunch, let's think about how important our relationship is with Canada, but that it's a relationship that should not and cannot be taken for granted. And in a few minutes after lunch, I'll invite Rachel, and she'll either defend or agree with what I just said, or what George said. But here's something a little sneaky that I did. I looked up Rachel on the internet and saw an article that she wrote. And she was asked to describe herself in 10 words. So rather than rehash the official bio that's on the side of the Consulate General, let's hear how Rachel McCormick describes herself. Mom, see, this is safe, right? Mom, proud Canadian, energy and environmental policy wonk, prairie girl. And then I'll add two more, a very good friend. Rachel, Dr. McCormick, received her PhD in environmental science from the University of Calgary, and that followed her undergraduate degree in environmental studies. So it's no surprise that she was based in Washington for a number of years as head of the environmental section. I have known her now for about a little over 2 years. Imagine coming to your new post, getting out, meeting everybody, being incredibly aggressive, and then suddenly on about March 12th, March 13th, said, you are now at home with your daughters and husband, not just for a week or two, but for the next, 15 or 18 months. As I mentioned, Canada has had a Consulate General for over 50 years, and it's one of the most important posts. She won't say this, but when they start ranking positions for Canada, the consulate, being Consul General in Dallas for these 5 states, is a higher post than being ambassador in a number of countries. Imagine working on the USMCA, NAFTA 2.0, the issue with the Keystone Pipeline, and not to be political, but how would you like to have to call on that former Canadian resident, former Canadian citizen, Ted Cruz? So with that, let me welcome Rachel McCormick to the stage.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for welcoming me. It's really a true pleasure to be here, and thank you to Jim. I was in town this week for an oil and gas regulators conference. I was just telling the mayor that, and congratulations again to you. This is I'll have been in Santa Fe 3 times in 3 months. Once we started moving around again, because everybody wants to have their conference in Santa Fe. So, and I'm not going to complain. I'm very lucky to represent the Prime Minister and the Government of Canada in New Mexico, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas. And it is a great big region, and it is an important relationship for Canada. Your president in 1961 said, geography made us neighbors, history made us friends, and necessity made us allies. And I think that's really true. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to play a little game here. Hands up if you're related to somebody that's Canadian. Hands up if you've done business with somebody that's Canadian, or worked with somebody that's Canadian. And hands up if you've been to Canada. So, we're very, very connected, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But we are partners, and I think it's true that we can be forgotten. It's like we're the very nice neighbor, right? We're the very nice neighbor that doesn't kick up fuss, doesn't say a lot. But we also have, just like all neighbors, we have conflict sometimes. We have differences of opinion, and I think we solve problems together. And we face the world together. We really do coordinate at the international level, and we are a balancing voice to the voices of Europe and Asia in many forms, and I think that's important. So what I'm going to dig into today a little bit is we always think about the Canada-U.S. relationship as having 3 pillars. And as Jim mentioned, I was at our embassy in Washington, D.C. for 5 years before coming to Dallas. I have to say, it kind of felt like moving countries. It is a wonderful, wonderful space to be in, because it is the most important relationship that Canada has. So I was very honored to be posted there for 5 years, and I actually chose to stay longer than I had originally intended because of that. And when you think about energy and environment, that's one of our pillars I'll get into. But 43% of our border is water. We have the longest undefended border in the world. We share air sheds, we share water. We have 20% of the world's fresh water together that we have to protect. If you are somebody who enjoys birding or hunting, we are your duck factory of the north. And we'll get into some of the trade dilemmas we've had over the last 7 years or so. But there was a moment where the Commerce Secretary was at the embassy for an event, and we were having some difficulties about steel and aluminum taxes, and we said, well, we're just going to put duck tax on. And a lot of the people at that time in the administration were hunters, so it said what we were thinking. So I'm going to talk about those 3 pillars: trade, energy and environment, borders, security, and foreign policy. And I'm going to give you a bit of sense of what's happening in Canada, but also the Canada-US dimension, and then happy to really talk about anything you might be interested in. So on trade, Canada is really a committed trading nation. We have free trade agreements with 49 countries that reach 2/3 of the global GDP. So that's 1.5 billion customers in the world. And of course, we all know about the North American Free Trade Agreement that was modernized into a progressive and modernized USMCA. United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. In Canada, we call it the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement. In Mexico, it was easier when it was NAFTA. So I'm just going to tell you that. But from the time that the NAFTA was signed in 1994, the trade has quadrupled within North America. So yes, we have access to 2/3 of the global GDP in the world, but our biggest trading partner is the US, and we are also the US's biggest trading partner. $1.3 million goes across our border every minute of every day. $2 billion every day. And that's millions of jobs on both sides of each border. So our prosperity, our integrated supply chains, our jobs and our growth is very highly dependent on each other. So what do we do when we modernize the USMCA? And I have to say, that was a difficult time. There was an existential threat to how our businesses work together and how our countries work together as we were renegotiating that. But I have to say, 2 years of hard negotiations, I think really did bring us to what I would say is a modernized and progressive trade agreement for this continent. Some of the things that changed, we have a digital economy chapter. When we first negotiated NAFTA, if you were dialing up on your computer, you were hearing that. And of course, we wouldn't be buying things on Amazon or buying films and all this digital economy, so that was a really important modernization. We added culture. We added a chapter on small and medium-sized enterprises, and in Canada, over 90% of our businesses have under 100 people, and so they really are the little engines that could in our economy. We had negotiated side agreements on both environment and labor with NAFTA. We brought them into the agreement, and so they're also part of the dispute settlement process. We also did rules of origin for autos, and it was really, really innovative in the sense that it wasn't just about the content of the cars and that it had to come from within our countries, but also that a certain proportion of the parts had to be made with labor that was paid at a certain level. So it was really about raising quality of jobs across North America as well. So New Mexico actually exports $400 million a year to Canada. We are actually your #1 export for hatch chilies. I know. And for any of you that shop at H-E-B or Central Market or any of those places, it's actually manufacturers, especially in Quebec, that make a lot of those specialty branded products for H-E-B with the hatch chili in it. And so there's lots of connections there. We also have 51 Canadian-owned businesses here in New Mexico that give thousands of jobs to those people here. 3 examples of Canadian companies I just want to mention. Smart Cone Technologies. It was a finalist in 2019 in the Army Hyperspace Challenge, and it's a safety and Internet of Things company. What does that mean? It has sensors to help people be more safe on their workplace. It's for biking, traffic, crowd control. And so they're now invested here, and they're located in Albuquerque. Epcor USA, Water Management, they're a subsidiary of an Edmonton-based municipal utility, and they serve 19,000 New Mexicans for water treatment and infrastructure. And the New Mexico Gas Company is also a subsidiary of Halifax-based Emera, so the largest natural gas utility in New Mexico. So just some examples of how New Mexico and Canada are connected. And I actually visited Hatch this summer, I have to say. Possibly the best burger I've ever had at Sparky's. And my kids still ask about the milkshake, so it has left an impact. We spent our summer in New Mexico, our summer holiday in southern New Mexico, and it was beautiful. The people, but also the places and the history. And we've already started planning our next trip, which will cover the northern half of the state. And you really are so lucky to live in this beautiful place. And so we'll be coming back lots of times. I want to get to the point of supply chain integration. So 70% of what U.S. imports from Canada is used to make goods. So if you think about whether it's like crude coming down from Canada that's refined and exported as petroleum, whether it's wheat that comes down and is made into pasta, etc. It's about that integration. And then for Canada, 25% of what we send to you in terms of a finished good is actually from the US. And 14% of what we send internationally is actually made of stuff from the US. So it's really integration. And so we share things, we make things together. And the auto sector is a really great example of that. It's $110 billion that goes across our border back and forth every year. That would be a lot. In the auto sector alone. And 51% of a car made in Canada is from the United States, and 49% of a car made in the United States came from Canada. And it's because we specialize, and it just makes sense. And so I think when we think about trade and how dependent we are, we kind of take that for advantage sometimes. We don't really think about how important that is. But right now, as we all are suffering from supply chain shortages, we really need to think about that. Because as I said, we can be the quiet neighbor that doesn't necessarily raise our hand and talk about how important our relationship is. So critical minerals. Critical minerals are really important for the future economy. There are things like lithium to make batteries. There are things like uranium for your defense sector, for the power sector, depending on where you're living. There are things like potash for fertilizer. And Canada has 31 critical minerals. The US is highly dependent on imports for critical minerals. And these are things that are central to innovation. They're central to pretty much every sector: telecom, autos, renewables, etc. And so one of the things we're looking at in terms of that integrated supply chain is how do we ensure North America is strong on critical minerals? How do we work together to make sure that we are secure? I'll tell you a little story about uranium. I know it has its difficulties in terms of some of the political history of use of uranium, but I want to just give this example. Under the previous administration, there's a provision under the Trade Act called Section 232, which allows the administration to put a tariff on products coming into the United States based on national security concerns. Steel and aluminum tariffs were applied to Canada. I will be honest with you that it will take a while for Canadians to understand how we were a national security risk, given our long-standing allyship and how integrated our supply chains are. But uranium was another investigation. And what we were able to show, and I think this is just really demonstrative of the importance of us working on critical minerals together, is Cameco, which is a company based in northern Saskatchewan, my home province, is the only market-based supplier of uranium in the world. All of the other producers of uranium are state-owned enterprises, and largely from non-allied countries. And so we said, so if you put a tariff, and at that point the market was being flooded. So the prices of uranium were very low. Cameco was actually buying from the market rather than producing, which was putting Canadians, and especially First Nations, out of work in northern Saskatchewan. So what we said was, So if you apply this tariff to us the same way you were to a state-owned enterprise, the only market-based supplier, the only North American-based supplier will be out of business. And that is not good for our economies, that is not good for our national security, and that is not good for foreign policy. And so I think that intersection in terms of supply chain security and foreign policy is really important. Canada is number 1 globally in potash, number 2 in niobium and uranium, 3rd in titanium, palladium, 4th in aluminum and platinum, and 5th in graphite and nickel. And so as we have trade challenges, I think we need to think about those integrated supply chains, whether it's the auto sector, whether it's our cultural industries, or whether it's critical minerals, and really think about trade policy, not just in terms of businesses, but also in terms of our foreign policy connections and the implications for the future. So just getting into some of the other challenges, softwood lumber has been a long-standing challenge between our countries. I mentioned the 232 investigations. And I have to say, for the 232 investigations, one of the things that we've always said is we are actually considered a domestic source of procurement for your Department of Defense. We are part of the National Defense Technology Base for your defense industry. And so to consider it a national security threat for something from Canada when your defense industry considers this domestic procurement is a bit of a mixed message. And even now, I have to say, in many, many ways, my Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden have a lot of alignment on climate, on a lot of foreign policy issues, on diversity, equity, and inclusion, on working with First Nations and tribes, on so many things. But we still have challenges on trade. And I think one of the biggest things we're talking about right now is in the infrastructure bill, Buy America requirements. And so, sounds really good. And can you imagine any senator or congressperson voting against Buy America? Like, it'd be political suicide, right? Except for when you think about how integrated our supply chains are. So something similar happened in 2009, and I'll tell you a story of what happened. So there was a chemical company in my region that I cover that exported to a pipe building company for water infrastructure projects, so helping clean water, getting things better for communities. And that company was an American company invested in Canada. The main market for that chemical supplier was that pipe company in Canada. That company, had an integrated supply chain, making different types of pipe for water infrastructure projects all over North America. But because the pipe was made in Alberta, it wasn't able to be used in an infrastructure project in the same state as those chemicals came from. So what happens to that project? It sits for 9 months until the exceptions are found, and then it gets built. And so we always say, we want you guys to succeed. We want you to have jobs. We want you to have prosperity because it's good for us, right? We want that. But trying to separate our supply chains, especially right now, as supply chains are very constrained already, has unintended consequences. And so given the fact we're considered a domestic source for defense reasons, given the fact our critical infrastructure is connected, whether it's electricity, whether it's satellites, we all share that together, or if it's just about the fact that it's really hard to build these projects. Can you imagine having no concrete, no wood, no glass, none of these things, and we're not the target? We know that, and when we talk to people that are elected, they know that too. So we're trying to find an elegant solution that recognizes our integrated supply chains, and also the fact that we have the same laws in terms of not allowing imported products that are made from forced labor. Very similar environmental laws, and in some cases higher in Canada as well. So moving to energy and environment and connected infrastructure, we have 74 pipelines that go back and forth between our countries and 34 electricity transmission lines. The grid in North America really goes north-south more than it goes east-west. And except for Texas, we're connected to pretty much every state in the United States. And we could make an argument that we're connected to the Panhandle, but that doesn't go well politically. So we are the largest supplier of energy. 61% of the imports of crude are now from Canada. And that's about 20% higher than it was even 10 years ago. So we're very much higher than OPEC. And so we're highly integrated, and a lot of the people that produce energy operate in both countries. And of course, Jim mentioned Keystone XL, which is the most famous pipeline that's never been built. And I've spent much of the last 10 years having discussions about Keystone XL, and so I'm happy to talk about that in any ways. One of the things I think that's important to consider in all of this is Canada is highly, highly committed to climate change. There's no question, and we can get into what our climate policies are in a second. But we are the only country from whom you import oil that passes an infrastructure test to get their product to market. So when your refineries need heavy crude, there's only a few countries that are going to be able to supply that. So it can come from Saudi, it can come from Venezuela, it can come from various other places off the coast and right into the California harbor and come into your pipelines. From Canada, it's coming through a pipeline. So there's an extra test there. So you can say we only want this pipeline built if it meets this standard in terms of community engagement. We can only want this unless it's meeting this climate standard. And we're all in. We're all in. But remember, that other 49% that's coming in off the coast, or 39%, I was told there'd be no math. 39% that comes off the coast doesn't have those tests. And it's not helping us on the climate question. It's not helping us on human rights in the energy sector. And so we just have to have an honest conversation. If the refineries are being filled and they need that crude is being used, how do we ensure that test is applied to make sure that we're making all of the global energy sector more progressive and important for the environment? The transmission lines are the same thing. It's really hard to build infrastructure. You all know this. We have, in Canada, 86% of our electricity sector is carbon-free. 63% of it is hydro. And so we export anywhere from 2% to 24% of the electricity imports that the United States have, depending on the sector, depending on the region. So like New England, we export a lot more too. Great project that got built between Manitoba and Minnesota Power. Manitoba Power, Minnesota Power, allowed phasing out of coal, but provided that base load of hydro, because seriously, if you lift up the floodgates in northern Manitoba, it's 10 minutes to meet peak power in Minnesota. So it allows those intermittent renewables that are local to be facilitated, and you don't need our hydro, you don't buy the hydro, but you need the transmission line to be able to get it there. Or you need base load in coal or gas, hopefully at some point storage, but it works really, really well. And in fact, we buy about 600, we actually exchange about 600 megawatts a year just because of seasonal differences. It gets kind of cold in Canada, and so we take more of your energy when it's warmer down here. But we have 6 other lines that have been approved, and we just can't get them built because of local opposition, and obviously we want to engage communities, we're talking to communities, but it's a question about how do we meet these climate outcomes that we want to meet. So Massachusetts has set a goal of a very high percentage of renewables. They've run an RFP process multiple times now, and it's always Canadian projects that are the bulk of that opportunity, but we can't build the lines. The first project was meant to go through Vermont and New Hampshire. The proponents were willing to invest a whole bunch in a state park, but there was 110 miles of the line that they just couldn't bury. They call it the Granite State for a reason. And so that project just didn't go forward. And then the second project that won is a great project, but Maine has voted that they don't want the line going through their state. And so absolutely, all of these citizens and states should have a say. But I think we have to have an honest conversation about how we move energy if we want to meet these goals. And what infrastructure will look like. Because you're going to need that to electrify the economy. You're going to need that to have electric vehicles. You're going to need infrastructure for a hydrogen economy. All of those things need infrastructure, and it's just really difficult to build that right now. And so I think we need to have a good conversation about that. So turning to climate change, just about what Canada is doing right now. So our original goal for 2030 was to have 30% reduction of emissions from 2005. We have increased that to 40 to 45%. What are the things we're doing? We have a price on carbon in Canada. So we're currently at $40 a carbon dioxide equivalent ton. So that's applied to all of our industrial and energy sector, as well as at the pump. It will go to $50 a ton next year, and then it will go up $15 a year until we hit $170 a ton. And that price on carbon is meant to incent innovation. It's meant to create markets where people are able to reduce emissions and also make money. It's not telling people how to do it, it's telling them this is the price of not doing it. And so we have seen great innovations as a result of this. We have 2 demonstration projects for carbon-free aluminum right now. We've reduced the per barrel emissions in the Canadian oil sector by 25% in the last 10 years, and we expect those to go down by half in the next 10 years, so 50% reduction per barrel. And we now have announced as of the Glasgow Summit, that we will have an absolute cap on emissions. So it won't just be on the intensity of a barrel, but it will be an absolute cap. And it's not saying we're putting a cap on production, it's saying we have put a cap on the emissions. So if we find the technologies and innovations for our oil and gas sector to continue to operate, but capture the CO2, reduce the emissions, reduce the methane, etc., that should be part of the future energy solution. And I know New Mexico is really leading the way in terms of oil and gas producing states in the United States as well on that. We're doing a lot on the nature side, planting trees, working with First Nations to build protected areas, and we have a commitment of conserving 30% of our land and waters by 2030. We have a coal phase out. Unabated coal will be phased out by 2030. We're at about 9% coal in our electricity sector right now. And then we're also doing a lot of work in innovation as well. Our leaders, I'm going to just turn to the broader relationship right now between Canada and the US. So President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau established what we call the roadmap. What's the roadmap for our relationship? So what were the priorities in that? First of all, probably to nobody's surprise, COVID-19. So cooperating in terms of science, data, health. You may have noticed that the border's open. So all of my Canadian colleagues, Canadian friends in the room, you can now drive down. Very important to my mother-in-law. She did not get to come down to the south last year in the winter. And so the idea of flying down for 4 months was not overly exciting to her because she wanted to bring her own golf clubs and her own coffee maker and have her car. And so it was hurting all of your economies, right? It was hard because we could always fly down, but we couldn't drive down. And so with the borders open. But I think it's a testament to our countries that on March 12th, we decided to close our borders together. And our essential trade went back and forth the whole time. We were able to keep our trade, keep goods and services, essential workers going back between our countries the whole time. And I think that's a testament to our relationship. We're also working to give globally vaccines to other countries. We also are collaborating on building back better. And that's about clean growth. It's about supply chain security, critical minerals, net zero industrial transformation, as well as that electricity transmission to bring Canadian electricity down to help with the electrification of the economy. But as I mentioned before, there's challenges on that front for us to actually get that done. We agreed to work together on climate change, and we agreed to work together on diversity, equity, and inclusion. On diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think it's important for me to recognize that we have different challenges in Canada, some shared challenges. But the last year and a half has been a really difficult public conversation in Canada as we saw firsthand in a very concrete way the things that had been reported in our Truth and Reconciliation Commission in terms of the relationship with our First Nations. And there is parallels to the United States on this. And so this is really the commission that looked into the impacts of Indian and residential schools in Canada. And you may have seen on the news the graves that were found at those residential schools. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission put forward over 150 calls to action in terms of how we recognize the truth of our past and also build forward in terms of reconciliation with those communities. And this last year, part of that was actually confirming those graves, confirming those child's lives lost, and recognizing that it's an intergenerational impact. I was in southern New Mexico, as I mentioned, earlier in the summer, and there was a placard outside of an art museum that talked about the Indian and residential schools in New Mexico. And the policy goals and statements were almost exactly the same. It was kill the Indian and the child. And they had work fare, the kids had to work, there was challenges in terms of how the children were treated in both locations. And so, although we have much shared history that we can celebrate, I also think we can learn from the difficult history that we share. And so we've established conversations. For example, we have a Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's initiative in Canada to better understand that challenge and how to work with communities and police forces and the justice system. We've connected those from our commission to the commission that's happening here in New Mexico on residential schools. We'll make connections between experts on that. And so I just think it's important to recognize that some of these social issues, it's not just trade, it's not just science. We collaborate on a lot of things that matter to people, and it matters to cultures. We have a great relationship with IAIA down the road. We have a Canadian, my colleague Henry and some of our other colleagues have connected Indigenous curators in Canada and New Mexico to work together and collaborate. Last section I wanted to talk about is our collaboration on borders, security, and defense, which is part of the roadmap that was established between our leaders. And what they profiled was their ongoing commitment to NORAD. I'll get back to that in a second. Shared commitment against violent extremism, illegal trade, and then global challenges with China. So NORAD was established in 1958, and it's a North American aero defense system. And it is the longest joint standing command between two countries in the world. And so that aerospace warming and control was expanded in 2006 to include maritime. And I don't know how many of you have seen the Broadway show Come From Away, which is the story of 9/11 when the airspace was closed in the United States. It was actually the number 2 at NORAD who closed this airspace. The number 2 at NORAD is always a Canadian in Colorado Springs. They closed the airspace and all these planes were diverted to Newfoundland. And so when that play comes to New Mexico, you must go see it because it's the story of 6,000 stranded travelers that were welcomed by a town in Newfoundland of 7,000 people. And they welcome them into their homes, into their schools, and it's a wonderful, wonderful story. And I've been so fortunate to get to know some of the plane people, as they're called, and the Captain Bass, who was the first female pilot at American Airlines, who's the main character, who's located in Fort Worth, and really worked with her because it's just such a great demonstration of the Canada-US relationship and how we work together and how we come together in hard times. We work together in NATO as well. We're very active in Latvia and Iraq right now. We're also the commander of the Maritime Standing Group #1 right now for NATO. Canada's feminist foreign policy agenda. What does that mean? It means that we truly, truly believe a country will not develop and be secure until all of its people have the right to an education and the right to work. And so empowering women and girls is a central part of our defense and our development and our foreign policy. And nowhere is that more true than in Afghanistan. We are working right now, we have committed to taking 40,000 vulnerable Afghan refugees, focusing on women and girls, the leaders that we worked with to advance the opportunities for women and girls in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, members of the LGBTQ community, translators that we worked with on the front lines. So we've committed to taking 40,000. We have always had for many, many years the ability for private sponsorship of refugees that will continue for the Afghanistan refugees. And we have also committed to taking additional 5,000 names of people identified by the US as people that helped them when they were in Afghanistan. On China, China is a very complex file, as you all know. The relationship is difficult and constrained, especially because of the arbitrary detention of Canadians in China, which many of you will have seen in the news, referred to as the two Michaels. We arrested a Huawei executive just over 3.5 years ago. The next day, two Canadian Michaels were detained in China without being able to see their embassy, their family, talk to anyone for over 1,000 days in a Chinese jail. The due process for the Huawei executive was carried out, and she was able to stay in a penthouse in Vancouver. And so we worked very closely with the Biden administration to advance an international collective statement about arbitrary detention, and we will continue to work against these injustices. We still have many Canadians, as there are Americans, that have been detained in China without access to consular support or their families, and so we'll continue to do that. We will continue to challenge China on the violation of rules and norms internationally on human rights for their own people, and promote the democracy and rule of law and human rights internationally in general. At the same time, we will find ways to cooperate on global issues. We know that we have to work with China on climate change. We know that we need to work on innovation with them. We have, as part of our climate policy, saying we will not support any World Bank funds, any IMF funds that support coal production, coal plant building in other countries, and we also have committed to stopping the export of coal. So we know that China and India and others are a big partner in climate change, and so we know we have to work with them on that. So I will stop there, and I'm really excited to talk with Jim and all of you on anything that you're interested in. Thanks.
Let's see if we can get the microphone, and we'll repeat the questions as needed. Here we go. Sounds like there's a lot of wind coming through. As well expected, wonderful presentation. I think you've covered so much, but I know there'll be some questions from the audience. So please raise your hand and stand up and give Rachel a good question. There we go. Yes, ma'am.
I found the baby stone XL pipeline a little bit, and one of the concerns I had as a citizen of this country is that it was running over the Oglala water, which is the water for the breadbasket of the United States. And there is no pipeline that's 100% non-leaking flow. And so I was very concerned about that. I was negative on the building of the pipeline. Would you comment on that?
Sure. I agree. I think the original project was designed by an engineer. It was a straight line. And I think that technically the engineering and the science was, we can keep that safe. We can monitor it, we can ensure safety. In Canada we have 99.999% of pipelines safety a year. Does that matter? Probably not, because that's a really important aquifer, and it's also important to the tribes that are in that region. And so over time, the project really evolved. And I think at the end, it became the poster child of the off-oil movement. So it would have been very difficult to approve, but for any administration, okay, so clearly the Trump administration did approve it, but it went around that aquifer. And by the end of the project, when it was ultimately denied, not only did it go around, it had agreements with tribes the entire distance of the U.S. side. It had agreements with First Nations on the entire Canadian side, and it was going to be powered by renewables in terms of the compressor stations. So in terms of if you're going to have a pipeline, it would have been probably the most progressive pipeline. If there's a question of moving off oil and not needing oil, that's something. But I agree with you on the aquifer. I think it was that pipeline design was initiated in a different era when pipelines were built in straight lines and communities weren't engaged. And I think it provoked a really important conversation on how we build energy infrastructure.
Other questions? I have one. One area where our foreign policy has differed is in the Caribbean, and particularly on Cuba, and we have Ambassador Huddleston here. How has Canada been able to handle its relationship with Cuba?
So, I mean, we've had difficulties. We've had some difficulties as well. But I think, in general, Canada sees the Caribbean as our backyard. Part of that is our Commonwealth history with the entire region. Part of it is looking at the Caribbean as a group of countries where we need to think about the security of those people. So we were just talking about, for example, when we think about our Venezuela policy and the control that Venezuela has over Caribbean countries, including Cuba, including through the energy sector, looking at that as a whole. And I think it's really important. So our relationship with Cuba provided some of the space for the Obama administration to advance their relationship with Cuba. So the conversations that took place at the very senior levels were in Canada. So I think it's important for North America to have somebody that's having those conversations as we both promote democracy and human rights. I think we each have important relationships that the other one doesn't have. And so, you know, we're strongly committed to that, while also recognizing that it's not perfect. And our Canadian diplomats have had some similar challenges to American diplomats that have been posted there.
Ambassador?
Thank you very much for stimulating. So I'm curious about fisheries and conflicts, I think, between northern New England sometime and Canada in terms of quotas or fishing grounds, overfishing. Could you talk on that a little bit?
And did everybody hear the question? You'll hear the answer. It's about fisheries.
So the question was really about some of the difficult situations and conversations that we have over fisheries management, especially in New England. So I mentioned I headed the Energy and Environment section in Washington, D.C. for 5 years, and nothing gets front page, ambassadorial, Prime Minister's attention like a conflict over fisheries because it's local, right? Like things get very heated very fast. So some examples, you know, in New England, if you look at photos of the beach and the seals that are eating certain populations of fish in New England that are decimating fisheries, it's really amazing. And these seals and walruses and others they're smart. Like you can build a fish ladder and they'll just go up in the top and it's like smorgasbord, right? But the U.S. has a very strong Marine Mammal Protection Act. And so one of the challenges that we've had, one of the conversations that is always ongoing, is how we manage marine mammal populations. Because fisheries products can't be imported from Canada into the United States if there was a marine mammal harmed in the catching of that fish. But there has to be a conversation when the marine mammals are decimating the entire fish stock and then no fisher people are able to catch anything. So we have to work together on that sort of wildlife management issue, and it gets very political very fast. And the conservation groups, and I understand it's not an easy nut to crack. We have had some very tense moments on the water between fishing communities over whether somebody's in whose land. We had the same thing in Europe, and right now we were just talking about the fact we had lobster wars about 10 years ago about where lobsters were being caught and whether the Canadian fishermen and fisherwomen were going into the U.S. waters or not. Interesting conversation right now because due to climate change, all of the lobsters are going north. And so the waters off of Maine are too warm for them now. And so we're like, hey, guess what? Guess whose water you're in now? And so, you know, like the measurement of the lobsters and everything, so it can get very testy very fast. But what I can say is that our scientists work together really well to manage those populations because they do move across our borders, and we have to work together to manage them. It just gets really difficult when it gets on the front page of the news or politics get involved, because then the scientific result is probably not the result that's going to get achieved.
I'm glad you brought up we'll get you right next. I'm glad you brought up politics because, you know, we get so little coverage of Canadian domestic politics here. We know that there was an election a few months ago, and Prime Minister Trudeau was re-elected. But just give us an overview, if you can, about some of the issues that really drive politics in Canada, and are you seeing any type of the polarization we're seeing in this country?
Sure. So I think most of you know this, but I'm just going to give like a 15-second primer. We're a parliamentary system, and so our cabinet members are elected officials. We have a five-party system, 5 officially recognized parties. So we have the New Democratic Party, which would be the left of center. We have the Liberals. We have the Bloc Québécois, which only operate in Quebec. And then we have the Conservative Party, and we now have, and the Green Party is also an official party of Canada. And then we now have what's called the People's Party of Canada. And so this starts getting to the question of that polarization, which I would say the right of our political spectrum, and I always say our political spectrum is like half as big and shifted to the left in terms of where the political spectrum is in the United States. But the right has, in the last 40 years, on a number of occasions, split and come back together. And it really is about that tail end of the spectrum. And so we now have the People's Party of Canada, which got almost 1 million votes in the last election. It would be like your Tea Party splitting off and being its own party. That would be, I guess, the easiest parallel. So is there division? Absolutely. What are some of the issues that were key during the last 2 elections? Another big difference. So our last election was 30 days, you guys. We were talking today about how little time your elected officials get to actually govern because they're constantly in election mode. And so the rule in Canada is until the writ is dropped, you can't spend money on political campaigning. And then you have until the election day. So it's 30 days. And so I think that makes a difference in terms of having that constant political division and that advertising and everything else. I think that makes a difference. 2 elections ago, I would say the deciding issue was climate change. The Conservative Party did not have a very detailed policy focus in their climate change platform, and I would say most pundits would say that made the difference for them. This election, it was COVID. Quite honestly, the results of this election, it didn't change. We have one more the Liberals have 1 more seat, 2 more seats in Parliament. The Green Party has 1 less. So little differences, but what was important is that almost 1 million votes of the People's Party of Canada. Because if the right had been combined, the result could have been very different. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as that evolves and whether that party continues to gain more speed. They're definitely not going quiet into the night. They did not get any seats in Parliament, but the folks that ran for them and the leader of their party is very vocal still.
But you mentioned a number of things that we still have to consider. And my question is kind of clear. Have you found that under the Biden administration, things are moving more smoothly than the last administration, or no?
And the question is, are you seeing things moving more smoothly under President Biden than you did under President Trump?
It's very different. I'm a diplomat.
You're not reading tweets every day.
It's very different. Yes, there's definitely little shocks to the system where you're like, wake up and you're like, are you kidding? I never saw that coming. I mean, Buy America in the infrastructure legislation is tough. It's tough. The electric vehicle provisions in the reconciliation bill that are being put forward by the Michigan delegation are tough, especially after we just negotiated the USMCA and our agreement on how to work on autos. So this electric vehicle credit would essentially give $15,000 to cars that were completely made in the U.S. with all U.S. parts and from unionized labor. I can tell you every governor, except for Michigan, is worried about this because of the way supply chains work. And if you look at your car lots right now, and the fact that there's no cars on the lots, if you can't have any imported pieces for building a vehicle, I don't really know how you're going to get enough vehicles to have that $15,000 tax credit. We're worried that this is going to very much impact the North American auto sector in terms of our competitiveness internationally. And like I said, we have a lot of lithium. We have a ton of investments coming in to build batteries. We're not going to not sell them because you can't use them in your cars. We're going to sell them to other markets.
Well, that's a perfect example of logic and people working together on those pickups. Is that not happening?
Yeah, and so definitely we're having a lot of conversations, but a lot of this is being advanced through Congress, and there's a lot of space for conversation and cooperation and collaboration on Congress. We go up to the Hill, everyone we talk to about, not necessarily an exception for Canada, but a carve-in based on principles, like being part of the domestic industrial base for the defense sector, like our connected infrastructure, like our critical supply chains. And so everyone says yes, but there's not really a space to fix it because there's not a space to have that conversation to fix it. So we're still finding ways and hoping to do that. So, on 85% of things, we're on the same page as the Biden administration, but then it's a little bit, now I won't be, this isn't a diplomatic term, but it's like with President Trump, it was an existential conversation about our relationship in terms of trade, right? Because there was a threat that NAFTA was going to be torn up. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean for all of the tariff-free goods that have been going back and forth, that $1 billion a day? How do you do that? So we were, like with the steel and aluminum tariffs, we by state showed, because we put a retaliatory tariff on for everything with steel and aluminum, and we were strategic. Bourbon from Kentucky, wine from California. We looked at, we will never escalate, but we will come back with the same amount. Because we have free trade agreements for a reason. And there's a rule, and we want to work with that. Doesn't sound very Canadian, sorry. But we will politely decline to be taken advantage of where we have rules that are agreed upon. So I think it's it's a bit of a whack-a-mole with some of these protectionist policies because they're very specific, and you have to find them and try to fix them before they get too far down the road. Where tearing up NAFTA was a very different situation.
Last question.
Is there a negative reaction to immigration coming into Canada, asylum seekers, refugees, that sort of thing, the way we have in the United States? What's the general attitude in Canada?
What's the general attitude towards immigration in Canada, and is it different than what we're seeing in the United States?
I think it is. I think we call them new Canadians. I think even the term is different. And when I go home, I think we really recognize the richness that diversity brings our country. And very few people will say, like, I'm Irish Canadian, I'm English Canadian, and they're new Canadians, but they are African, or they are French, so it's not a hyphenated. It's an interesting difference, but I think it's an important one. We are also very, very committed to immigration. Like, we had a goal of 1 million new Canadians 3 years ago, because we know that it's important for our economy. And we have a very dedicated group under our Trade Commissioner Service that advances what's called our global skills strategy. So companies, American companies can, for example, if they have an office in Canada, often it's a research office or an analytics office or collaboration with universities, we can, if there's a skills gap, like highly sought after, whether it's software engineer or something like that from another country, we can, on average, process a visa for them and their family in 4 weeks if a company has a job for them. And we'll work to keep them in Canada and have that company continue to hold those jobs in Canada and grow our economy through immigration.
How did you handle the visas for those who worked with Canadian troops in Afghanistan?
So that's ongoing. So as I mentioned, we have a commitment to 40,000 vulnerable Afghani refugees. We were originally at 20,000 plus the 5 for American referred, and then now we've added another 20,000. We've processed about 9,500, and about a third of those are in Canada. It's slow, but it's quick. It's slow, but it's quick, right? So we've already got 9,000 processed and 3,000 in country, with that commitment to 4,000. And as I mentioned, there's priority communities, but also sponsorships, and that's something we've done for 50 years, is the ability to sponsor refugees, whether it's through churches or organizations. And all of those people or organizations that sponsor refugees are accredited in Canada. And so we work with UNHCR to identify refugees. We work with a lot of the same systems as the US, but I actually think it's been pretty quick.
Any last words?
I'm so jealous of where you all live. Traffic in Dallas is not like traffic in Santa Fe. So I really thank you all for coming, and thank Jim for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be with you today, and I hope if anybody wants our contact information that you come and get it and stay in touch.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. And before I turn you loose, a few reminders and questions. Do you prefer a luncheon program, or would you like an evening program? Let me just see a show of hands. Who prefers luncheon programs? Wow, large majority for that. So I have a favor to ask of you. I am now getting behind the numbers at CIR, and we need more members. And someone said, well, why don't you just take out ads on public radio? Well, we don't have the money for that. The very best way that we can get members is I want you to look left and right and be sure that the person next to you is a member. And if they're not, see, I sound like a minister every so often. If they're not, don't let them out of your sight. And if they are a member and you're a member, would you please think about a good Christmas gift, a holiday gift? Give a membership to the CIR. Give it to a friend. Give it to a young student. Our membership right now is around 400 or so. Let's see if we can't get it up to 500 by year end. Will you help me do that? Will you help all of us do that? Great. Next thing, our program with Kati Martin is on December 6th. That's virtual. December 7th, Rachel, we're going to do that wonderful thing with The Economist, The World In, The World Ahead. And then I hinted about having a speaker at the end of January. We have the date now. It'll be January 28th, and that will be Martin Indyk, who was our ambassador to Israel not once, but twice, and he's written that wonderful book on Kissinger. Our gala is May 18th. Does anybody know who the speaker is yet? Have you figured it out? Chuck, you can't do that. All righty. Well, I think I gave a hint last time. I think I said that she had the person had ties to Russia. I will also say that you have seen this person on television a lot, and probably President Trump or Pompeo are not on her speed dial. So that's all I'm going to say until I see you later. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.